Okay, great. So let me get started. So I'm really excited to be here virtually. Wish I could be there in person to share this really new work in progress, very much in progress. Before I talk about this new work, I thought it might be helpful to briefly situate what I'm working on now in relationship to my first book, which is called, and this is the image from it, The Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race. So in this book, I consider how a range of figures at the turn of the 20th century imagine the skyscraper to potentially negate or muddle race as something to read from the body or to be experienced by one's own body. So, charting an era when the tallest building in most cities was 10 stories max in the late 19th century to going to something like the Empire State Building at 102 stories. So really trying to capture what that experience was like and what that change in scale, vantage point, and perception did to the ways that people imagined how they could see the race body and experience themselves as race subjects. So the book recounts how Americans grappled with how race was to be read or might endure as a meaningful category in cities in which bodies were hard to see and therefore know, be it from the top floor of the skyscraper, where you get all these accounts of writers describing everyone looking like black ants or black dots or black specks. This idea that the scale of the vertical city was going to obliterate the ability to see difference, or from the crowded streets at its feet, which had its own kind of distorting effect on the racial sign due to the density that the skyscraper helped facilitate. So, in pursuing this story about the skyscraper, I make the case for thinking about how architecture more broadly always shapes the perceptual life of race, and for attending to architecture as it produces the material conditions through which the racial sign appears. That to know race, right, and to understand racial formations, it requires an account of how architecture is always producing the conditions under which we see and experience race. So in this new book, I'm pivoting a little bit from a focus on architecture exclusively and primarily to a focus on real estate. So in the epilogue of The Black Skyscraper, I locate the afterlife of the story I tell about the early skyscraper in the invention of the mass suburb at the mid-century, which helped to rescue whiteness as a perceivable and appraisable category from the urban spaces that had threatened to erode its distinctiveness. So instead of thinking of white flight as something where previously white inhabitants moved to the suburbs, thinking about suburbanization as a process that produced a new condition of whiteness. And that to understand that story, we don't need to just look at the post war moment or the Great Migration moment, but back to the late 19th century when the skyscraper was already starting to make it difficult to feel confident in racial distinctions from a kind of visual perceptual point of view. Um, so this is a story that I'm trying to now follow up and actually tell in the second book, which is called Provisionally. I'm bad at titles, so this will probably change. Provisionally, though, it's called Residential Forms from the Rent Party to the Fair Housing Act. So in this book, I'm focusing on how America's transition to becoming a nation of homeowners for the first time remade categories of race and by extension, description and affect. And this slide is just a sense of some of the materials, like a brief archival tour through some of the things that I'm looking at in this project. The move to mass home ownership in the 20th century, perpetuated by new financial mechanisms like the 30-year mortgage, redlining's perceptual mandates, and the birth of new sciences such as appraisal and land use economics, organized around older racist science, altered how Americans experience the neighborhood as a social, spatial, and most importantly here as a racial unit. So how does the emergence of mass home ownership and the residential as a distinctive planning and bureaucratic category, how does it change the ways that race is known, described, and produced? So the first half of this talk, I'm going to give you a kind of a very abstract but still concrete overview of some key ideas, concepts, and interventions that are shaping the project. Like, what are the animating things behind this project? And the second half is going to pivot towards new work that I'm working on that's focused particularly on the 1930s. I'm going to focus on the different ways that W.B. Du Bois and Richard Wright, who I think of as spatial theorists, understood the broken promises of 40 acres and a mule in the wake of both the Great Depression and the Great Migration, raising questions about the utility of property more broadly as a vehicle for freedom or rights following the mass dispossessions, forced migrations, and ongoing racializations of real estate shaping Black life in the 1930s. So basically trying to think about how the renewed imaginary around reparations in the 30s may have not only something to do with the 30s or with the history of reparations, but with questions around property and housing that were also in the air in the 30s and the 40s. So that's the skeleton of what I'm going to do today. All right, so let's begin here. To begin to posit some of the project's animating questions, let me first offer a quote that has long haunted this project. So this quote has basically been with me since the beginning of this book. It's a thing that I keep coming back to as the anchor of this project. It comes from Herbert Hoover's 1931 presidential address to the White House Conference on Home Building and Homeownership, which was held in the wake of the Great Depression to spur new home construction and home purchasing. Despite the conference's social science emphasis, it brought together real estate developers, tradesmen, city planners, but also decorators, doctors, and psychologists. It's the idea that housing really was a multidisciplinary project and problem that needed all of these experts to convene to solve. But his remarks don't really reflect that. The president I'm interested in primarily turned to song lyrics in his address as evidence of homeownership's naturalness and necessity. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this first quote. Quote, there is a wide distinction between homes and mere housing. Those immortal ballads, Home Sweet Home, My Old Kentucky Home, and Little Gray Home in the West, were not written about tenements or apartments. They are the expressions of racial longing, which find outlet in the living poetry and songs of our people. Then he goes on to say, we know that many of our people must at all times live under other conditions, but they never sing songs about a pile of rent receipts. To own one home is a physical expression of individualism, of enterprise, of independence, of freedom, of spirit. We do not in our imagination attach to a transitory place that expression about a man's home being his castle, no matter what its constitutional rights may be. So I'm really interested in this quote, because how much it's invested in the mythos of home ownership, in the aesthetic qualities, of whether we sing songs about it, what the imagination can do, and how much this question of song and imagination and aesthetics are part of how he's already thinking about the project of the American dream of mass home ownership in the 20th century. Hoover's 1931 soaring property boosterism anchored in truisms about innately racial longings for property, peddled for centuries prior and absorbed by modern real estate guilds and thinkers in the early 20th century, largely succeeded. His conviction regarding the national hunger for ownership would go on to anchor the American dream, an aspiration made all the more achievable with the invention of the 30-year mortgage after the Great Depression. The federal government's interventions in the mortgage market helped a majority of Americans, mostly white, to own their homes for the first time in 1950, mostly located in all-white neighborhoods. Homeownership rates for minorities also rose in this period, but at a far slower pace, helping further cement the story, albeit a segregated one, of America as a nation of homeowners. So while the ground that Hoover laid in the 1930s, both in the aesthetic regime here, but also in terms of thinking about what it means to claim ownership as a racial longing, which has a long history, which I'll get into a little bit here. The cultural, so despite this well-trod rhetoric, the cultural landscape around Hoover proved far more vexed than his stroll through the National Songbook suggests. Hoover's remarks sidestepped Upton Sinclair's sensational warnings about the evils of contract buying in 1906's The Jungle, Jane Addams' 1911 stirring descriptions of her settlement experiment, and Sinclair Lewis's deflation of realtor speak touting homeownership's relentlessly sunny future in 1922's Babbitt. He further excised the rent parties Harlem Renaissance writers and musicians described in the 1920s that did manage to turn rent receipts into songs. There were lots of songs about rent receipts, so Hoover was just wrong there. And the president failed to anticipate the ongoing literary resistances and ambivalences to ownership by left-leaning writers like Richard Wright and John Steinbeck, but also on the other end of the spectrum, someone like a libertarian novelist like Josephine Lawrence, who we don't read anymore, but who wrote the first novel that I've ever seen to reference the HOLC and to rail against kind of government intervention in housing, long before Ayn Rand did it. For every ballad sanctifying the own home as the sweetest, there was another tale attesting to its inequities, hardships, and alternatives. Make sure I'm on the right side. Go back here. Residential forms insist that the spatial canons that have come to organize American aesthetics and culture in the 20th century have obscured homeownership's broader impact on the entwined histories of perception, race, aesthetics, and valuation, superseding regional typologies, right? And this is true. I'm coming from an English department, that's my home field. So we tend to break things up into, urban literature, suburban literature. There's a kind of rural modernism. And what I'm trying to think about is like, well, ownership is happening across all these spaces. So what if we thought about an ownership aesthetics as kind of driving the ways that we think about spatial aesthetics, rather than thinking of it in terms of regional typology, which is such a strong narrative, at least in the humanities. I focus instead on the residential, a concept spanning the urban, suburban, and rural that denotes the growing financial and ideological investment in homeownership mediated by state policies, private real estate markets, and nodes of racial surveillance buttressing the profitable business of spatial apartheid. The residential first emerged as a concept within bureaucratic discourses of zoning and real estate, but I recover its dual function as an experiential category, shaping how Americans perceived space, read both bodies and books, assessed value, and felt sovereign in relation to the spaces they call home. At the heart of this project is the story of how modern housing remade conventions of racial perception. The foremost factor in maintaining U.S. housing market stability after the Depression, as dictated by both the Federal Housing Administration and the private lenders following its lead, was the establishment of hard and soft forms of racial accounting, colloquially known as redlining, financially disincentivizing racially mixed neighborhoods and subsidizing predominantly white ones while ensuring Blacks paid higher interest rates and rents for worse housing. Redlining engineered not only new racialized geographies, but new perceptual strategies for assessing and valuing race. This book attends to what it newly meant to see race in residential settings, given the financialization increasingly accompanying this task. So that's still pretty abstract. So I'll try to really break down what I mean by thinking about redlining as a perceptual category that's training people how to see, right? Rather than just a reflection of racial categories that already existed. Before I do that, let me talk a little bit about the archive of this project. The archive anchoring this project is constituted by, let me just make sure I'm going where I want to go. Yep, okay. The archive anchoring this project is constituted by the literatures of residential segregation. This archive encompasses literary fiction, but also documents, forms, manuals, reportage, professional journals, and maps that variously represent descriptive processes of appraisal and valuation used to assess, maintain, and at times question the intertwined protocols for perceiving and assessing racial difference in residential space. The materials I take up treat the work of seeing and knowing race on the block as a problem and as active work, a matter of scientific, perceptual, historical, or financial deliberation requiring a variety of perceptual strategies, rather than treating race as a self-evident fact. These efforts to perceive and value race residentially indexes both new bureaucratic systems enshrining race. So for instance, realtors who insisted Blacks lacked an innate capacity to care for property, hence framing Black depreciation of property value as a universal law anchoring the free market, but also to more radical and experimental purposes in the 20th century. So on the other hand, I'm thinking about the ways that the early 20th century form of the rent party, where people threw rent parties in Harlem and Chicago and various other cities, fostered atmospheres of dispossession to keep Black renters housed, right? So how was the kind of a strategy of learning how to not own part of how people actually stayed in their housing? So the literatures of segregation thus encompasses materials emerging from professional real estate, housing, and appraisal discourses. So I'm reading a lot of manuals and textbooks and professional guild writing, but also other modes of urban observation, historical recovery, and cultural imagination, exploring the methods for and the utility of looking closely at and valuing residential space and the practices and capacities for ownership attached to racialized bodies. Writers variously described, bolstered, and rebuked homeownership's changing cadences in forms ranging from the literary to the bureaucratic. So for instance, one thing I'm interested in is why writers like Thomas Pynchon, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and James Baldwin all turned away from writing fiction at certain points of their career to write pieces of urban reportage. So what are they doing? What can't they do in the fiction? And why do they turn to forms of urban description that are self-consciously unfictionalized, right, to try to describe what urban space was? And I try to connect that practice to practices of appraisal, professional practices of appraisal that were also being moved and shaped in this moment, to think about what is a landscape of urban seeing, and how is appraisal as a burgeoning science shaping the ways that people are looking at and describing urban space more broadly. When such fictional writers implored their readers to look more closely at undervalued neighborhoods, we might ask what their imagined acts of looking were to accomplish in the wake of the professionalization of residential description in real estate and urbanism. Inversely, professional property appraisers posited themselves in manuals and textbooks as trafficking not in subjective assessment reducible to the merely literary, but as producing empirical facts about race and its market effects. The story of how these notional and speculative systems of racial appraisal and real estate appraisal shaped one another is not just one for economists and urbanists to tell. It is also fundamentally a story about the production of racial perception, shaped by housing's crucial role in stabilizing whiteness as property and a possessive investment, to invoke Cheryl Harris and George Lipsitz. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the humanities and what the humanities might have to contribute to such a discourse that's been so overwhelmingly owned by urbanists, by historians, by social scientists, architectural historians, etc. So a key question that I'm trying to ask is what the humanities can contribute to our understanding of homeownership, redlining, and segregation, not just in terms of evidence. So saying like, well, we could look at books. Like, is there a different kind of method or approach that we could actually bring to the table? How we read archives, how we read race, how we read redlining maps, how we approach textbooks and manuals and forms. So while homeownership's ascension in the 20th century US has primarily been charted by social scientists and historians, I argue that the mechanisms, observational modes, and genres, both ordering and ordered by mass homeownership, are a constructive part of the history of perception in American aesthetics. And just on this slide, these are just some of the incredible books that I am certainly grateful to, indebted to, and have learned so much from, that are written by social scientists, scholars of law, historians, right, about urban crisis, about the suburbs, about public housing, about the story of redlining, et cetera. And so again, just thinking about, well, where do the humanities fit in terms of telling the story? If real estate governs, as Reinhold Martin contends, residential forms attends to the range of narratives that gave shape to this governance, while considering how narrative both facilitates and disrupts property's reign in moments of boom, stagnation, and crisis. The cases made for and against homeownership in the early and middle 20th century relied on prescriptions about how ownership should feel. There's so much language about how ownership should feel good, and how people are inclined to feel good as owners. What kind of perception homeowners and appraisers should adopt. So how do appraisers and homeowners look at a home and decide whether it's a worthy or valuable place for them to live, right? That value itself is always a story, to a certain extent. And the reliability of one's racial sensorium to make judgments about the present and future value of a neighborhood, right? That so much of appraisal is about imagining a future, right? So how much does the sensorium play into that role? We know from redlining that there are all kinds of tricks and manipulations that blockbusters use to signal to white homeowners, right, that a Black invasion was coming, right? So much of this is about theater performance that's going to have a real world impact on free market values, right? So thinking about those kind of almost performative aspects that shaped ownership, racial performance, right? Shaping ownership is part of what I'm interested in. Determining the value of a single home or of homeownership more broadly, despite often being draped in the language of the free market, often relied on perceptual, aesthetic, and phenomenological evidence of race and its sensations, exceeding discourses of empiricism and land economics. If we consider redlining, the practice of devaluing certain neighborhoods in relation to their racial makeup, is not just a bureaucratic procedure, but as a perceptual system, then we must consider the discursive field of real estate as not only reacting to race as an index of property value, but remaking how race was seen, surveyed, and managed. And that's the crux of the story that I'm trying to tell, how real estate changed the way that race was seen and valued, right? Not just constantly reacting to it, was actually changing our perception and forms of valuation around race. Such an approach allows us to recapture the more muscular role real estate played in shaping how race was perceived and defined in mid-century. Real estate incentivized racism by financializing its assumptions while bureaucratizing its maintenance. Residential homeownership changed not only how people saw race, but who was tasked with assessing and surveying it, shifting the onus of racial litigation from residents to realtors, lenders, and government officials who largely determined who could purchase in specific neighborhoods. I tend to the honing of this institutional racial perception, something like seeing race like a bureaucracy that was central to redlining's operation. So while scholars have treated redlining maps of maps of redlined metropolitan areas as historical evidence, I focus on who was doing that surveying and under what matrices of racial observation, approaching redlining as both a perceptual system that produced habits of racial sight and an accounting of racial population. So this is basically the only remaining FHA map that we have, this map of Chicago, that's different than those kind of pastel HOLC maps, which we have plenty of. We only have one of the FHA's maps, and it's this one. So one thing I'm interested in, we know kind of the story of the different shades of red here that produce these different districts and how racialized these determinations of an A district was versus a D district. But what we don't know so much is what people were actually looking at and how they were making those assessments of who was living in what kind of a neighborhood and what their race was. Especially when we go back to the origins of some of these lists. This is Homer Hoyt's list from 100 Years of Land Values, where he gives this hierarchy of races and nationalities who, from 1 to 10, most appreciate real estate values. So number 1 is English, German, Scotch, Irish, Scandinavians. Number 10 is Mexicans. And then we get this footnote that this list was just prepared by a West Side real estate broker. So Hoyt takes this list and these categories, and then they become science, right? They become empirical fact, and they morph and they shift, right? The idea of telling the difference between Bohemians and Poles, right, becomes increasingly difficult or unprioritized as the 20th century progresses, right? But thinking about how these different kinds of categories and lists get made and the ways that they shape or don't shape and become treated as facts of the market is part of what I'm interested in, how people thought that they were going to go about and make these assessments and prove that they were true. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the origins of real estate very briefly, then I'll switch into the second half of this talk because the origins of real estate are important to this project to understand how some of the philosophies of racial difference and racial capacity really shaped the ways that real estate as a professional guild in the 20th century operated and was using much earlier racist science from the 19th century about racial capacity to own to kind of shape their understandings in order to kind of say that we need to look at some of this earlier writing in real estate from the turn of the 20th century to understand redlining and racialization and mass homeownership, rather than looking at the Great Migration or federal policies after the Great Depression, et cetera. Okay, so scholars in the social sciences have long studied the racial covenants, zoning ordinances, and neighborhood violence used to maintain residential segregation as law for decades and as practiced for much longer. But less well studied is the degree to which the philosophical arguments made by the first generation of professional realtors for mass homeownership were racialized from their earliest conceptualization, combining the rhetoric of scientific racism with vaguer platitudes about the health of civilization, the family, and the state. In other words, mass homeownership did not merely become a vehicle for residential segregation in the mid-century. Rather, realtors conceived of modern American homeownership as a racial enterprise from the start, catering to Anglo-Americans deemed innately built for it. A shared belief in property as a principally white capacity helped unite the real estate industry as a national profession at the turn of the 20th century, a profession that would go on to play a large role in shaping both state and private housing policy into the present. But first, before that, a quick history of homeownership rates in the US before the 20th century. Let's go to this slide. Homeownership rates in the US slowly declined between 1890 and 1920, largely hovering around 45%. So this is what you see basically here. pretty steady, but not super alarming, but increasingly kind of alarming for realtors and state officials, this dropping rate of home ownership. Um, while 19th century governmental incentives such as the Preemption Act of 1841 and the Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged continued white settler colonialism in the form of private ownership in the western frontier, the industrializing economy of the late 19th century drove a growing number of Americans towards urban centers, where they were much more likely to rent than to own. For an increasing number of Americans, to own one's home was no longer to own the means of production, meaning you're generating your living from the land, making residential ownership more a luxury than a necessity, a moral calling, or even a goal. So this idea that home ownership is like the be-all and end-all of the American dream doesn't really start until much later. And you can kind of see that for a number of reasons in this kind of declining home ownership rate. The difficulty of securing home financing. Let me take a sip of water. There we go. The difficulty of securing home financing for most, coupled with a plethora of new investment options other than the home, further contributed to ownership's decline in this period. For those with the means to buy, the home was one investment choice among many, including stocks, bonds, and commodity futures, rather than an inherently moral or noble pursuit, right? So if you wanted to make money, if you wanted to make an investment, the home at this period was not necessarily the natural place where you would go to do that. And for those of lesser means, home financing was far more onerous at the turn of the century than it would become after the state interventions following the Great Depression. Lenders generally required down payments of as much as 50% and granted mortgages for the much shorter terms of 5 to 10 years, making home ownership impossible for many working adults. So in fact, the norm for this part of the 19th century and early 20th century was that you would buy your home at the end of your life, because then you could finally afford it because the down payment was quite significant. So just a completely different ethos shaped by the kind of economic factors in home ownership, which are still, the case in many parts of the world. Facing eroding ownership rates, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, in partnership with the state, began in the 1910s to aggressively promote ownership, not just as a choice, but as a duty, a noble calling, and as a racial capacity. While philosophers, states, and settlers had long invoked the idea of the inherent property capacity of whites to justify a slew of maneuvers and laws in specific national contexts, the conceit of global Anglo-Saxon identity trumping national identity gained popularity in the 19th century. So let me break this down a little bit. So this is the star where you can see the kind of turning point happening where rates start to go up again. This is around 1918. And then we hit 1930 and the Great Depression happens. And then in the late 40s is when America becomes finally, for the first time, a majority home-owning nation. And so what I've been trying to chart is some of the language and the discourse that realtors were using to drive this spike here, mostly across the 20s before the 30s, but also helped allow for a kind of the recovery back to 50%, well over 50%. So looking at some of these early magazines and journals from what was used to be the National Association of Real Estate Exchanges, it would become the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and it's now the National Association of Realtors with the kind of little copyright. That are the reason why you have to, the word realtor is trademarked. So looking at some of their early journals and really trying to trace the language of Anglo-Saxon property capacity, as it was really a part of the kind of defining rhetoric of the journal, seeing language like this, right, about that property is inherently in the Anglo-Saxon heart, a feeling inherited from ancestors of centuries ago. So you see arguments that are about the ways that Anglo-Saxon law is based on the right to private property. Then you also see this language that's not so much about law, it's about the heart, it's about feeling, it's about capacity that's been inherited, that's genetic, right? And so these arguments about Anglo-Saxon capacity for property are some of the strains that I'm interested in tracking in this early language at the time when real estate was really becoming a national field and understood itself as a professional guild. And amassing state power, the ability to influence state power. Conjuring an image of a global white diasporic community united by the bonds of race, the reclamation of Anglo-Saxon heritage in this period served to stabilize a transhistorical and transnational vision of white supremacy. Drawing from the racialized arguments made to justify land grabs in the name of empire, settler colonialism, and expansion across the globe, American realtors repurposed this language to convince white Americans that the stakes of investing in domestic residential property were just as immense as extraterritorial expansion. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I just wanted to start to show some of the threads that I'm interested in tracing and the ways that this racialization of ownership was already kind of a part of the philosophy of realtors and land economics earlier than I think it's usually kind of discussed. Okay, so I'm going to really jump now to the 1930s, which is the work that I'm most actively doing at the moment. So recovering this historical context, this early historical context of the real estate journals is key to the project's initial chapters, but for the rest of this talk, I'll turn my attention to the 1930s. There we go. When the inroads towards homeownership made in the previous decade bolstered public propaganda initiatives trumpeting its transformative properties threatened to collapse. Even prior to the crash, realtors worried amongst themselves that peddling homeownership's sentimental ideology had limited efficacy without a larger restructuring of home financing, making mass ownership stable and viable in the long term. The Great Depression validated these fears by laying bare ownership's volatilities, severely testing the nation's faith in ownership's prosperity gospel. The large down payments and short-term mortgages required to own in the early 20th century set the stage for the decade's widespread dispossessions. As credit dried up and unemployment surged, property owners struggled to make payments or secure second mortgages, leading to mass foreclosures where owners lost both their down payments and their homes. In the first few years of the Depression, a third of farmers lost their land to foreclosure. Nearly half of all residential loans were delinquent, and home values declined 30% between 1928 and 1933. So no matter what kind of property you owned or where, most Americans experience the precarity of ownership in form. So my question going into this chapter is, well, why do people then regain their faith in property? Is it really just because of the state, or what kind of affective work had to be done to retether Americans to this desire to own, given all of the harm that ownership made possible, particularly in the first few years of the Great Depression? The housing reforms in the New Deal would eventually soothe the property scars of white Americans burnt by foreclosure and default during the Great Depression. By the 1950s, the state's efforts to subsidize the private lending market would turn the owned home for an expanded category of white Americans into an affordable and stable asset for both accruing wealth and passing it down. But from the vantage point of the 1930s, widespread home ownership for even the white middle class seemed far from certain. In fact, a number of social critics insisted that the nation's future depended upon destroying the sentimental myths of ownership's absolute virtue once and for all, in order for an expanded conception of good housing to take hold. And these are some of these articles who were making this case. In articles published in the New Republic and Survey Graphic and in standalone monographs, economists, journalists, and local officials insisted that the only way to keep people decently sheltered was for the government to stop reifying ownership and to start financing and subsidizing housing of all varieties. So this story, I think, is most often told in the emergence of public housing legislation that also comes about in response to the Great Depression and other kind of movements for public housing around the world. But I'm interested in this class of anti-ownership literature that isn't explicitly tied to the public housing movement, which I'll talk about in just a second. Such an overhaul in housing policy, these critics acknowledge, would fail if the structures of good feeling yoked to ownership weren't also dismantled. As journalist Rose M. Stein wrote in 1932, quote, "Every prospective home buyer should be immunized with an antitoxin against the blah blah of own your own home campaigns." Economist Stuart Chase echoed Stein's sentiments in 1938, describing the desire for homeownership as a cultural lag that was, quote, based more on sentiment and emotion than on facts. Quote, "Home and mother, the misty eye, the silent tear, the couplet of Eddie Guest, it is one of those immortal principles, splendid for things in general, but often disastrous for you and me and Adam." End quote. The chairman of the New York City Housing Authority, Langdon Post, similarly bemoaned what he deemed, quote, the wicked exploitation of the natural desire to own a home, which had swept the country during the 1920s. Quote, speculators in real estate have been and still are able to persuade the public that the purchase of real estate is an investment. Land is something which can be seen and felt and lived on, which makes people, again, particularly susceptible to this idea that real estate is a good investment. These critics agreed that providing better housing to the masses entails shaking the nation's faith in ownership's uncontested providence. So much of this was a question of feeling and not only a question of finances or economics. The charge to deconfect from ownership was answered by cultural production from the 30s in a number of ways. Writers, filmmakers, and artists persistently represented the trials and tribulations as well as the series of bad feelings accompanying ownership. The pain of property lost and denied anchored a range of reformed epics, reparative melodramas, and didactic satires in the decade confronting the trauma of dispossession. Some of these works, operating in the mold of the 19th century theatrical genre mortgage melodrama, imagined a family's life-altering experience of dispossession to only deepen their hunger for ownership stability, ultimately reifying homeownership as the horizon of American aspiration. That might be something like Gone with the Wind, even though it's not set in the 30s. It's certainly written in the context of the 30s, imagining that land is the only thing that can cure a broken heart, right? Others actively combated the misty eye and silent tear, long associated with the owned hearth, narratives that satirized those tropes or expensively more your reader towards other ways of conceiving security and respite. One thing I'm trying to write about, these two Betty Boop cartoons. There are two Betty Boop cartoons about dispossession. One is about rural dispossession, where Betty Boop is a farmer, if you can believe it. And this one, and then here with the planets, this is more about residential dispossession, where eventually we learn that the earth is being auctioned off between the planets to be reoccupied. But no matter whether a work ultimately glorified property's pursuit or narrated the process of becoming disillusioned with its promises for good, narratives in the 1930s regularly centered property as a problem that was both economic and affective in nature. The question of how it felt to own and be disowned, or to be denied access to ownership at all, alongside the moral and financial value of ownership, were all up for grabs in this decade. How then does the faith in the property of the owned home not just survive the Great Depression, but come back sure on the other side? How does the white middle class maintain its faith in property as a form of security and mobility in the wake of mass foreclosures? And why do members of the Black middle class, following even more devastating levels of dispossession, continue to yoke their hopes for civil rights to access to property rights? In answering these questions, historians have focused on the housing reforms following from the New Deal that eventually subsidized homeownership for whites and created long-lasting and stable forms of housing segregation by further subsidizing the construction of mass suburbs. The federal support for suburban developments went hand in hand with state-sponsored disinvestment from minority communities, increasing both the wealth and ownership racial gaps. And yet, if we return to the warnings issued by journalists that the effective attachment to ownership was just as important as its financial stability, we should also look to cultural production of the 1930s as it encouraged both white reconciliation with ownership as an asset, bestowing a racialized sense of security, and set the scene for Black reinvestment in property rights as a vehicle for civil rights. In this larger work, I'm looking at narrative's role in not only resecuring the relationship between whiteness and ownership threatened by the Great Depression, but thickening these tethers, looking at work by John Steinbeck of Grapes of Wrath fame, Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind, and even something like Laurel Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie. And in the second half of this chapter, which I'm going to talk a little bit about for the rest of the time today, I'm considering how property shaped the contours of Black freedom struggles in the 30s and the early 40s. While the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule took on new life in the public sphere of the 1930s, the meaning of this historical specter proved wildly unstable following mass foreclosures disproportionately affecting African Americans, as well as the ongoing migration of Southern Blacks giving up for good on the hopes of owning farmland to take their chances on Northern rental markets. I conclude by tracing this tension in the work of W.B. Du Bois and Richard Wright regarding the value of Reconstruction to both past and present. What kind of a resource was Reconstruction for these writers, as large numbers of African Americans continue to give up on the idea of agrarian self-sufficiency via ownership to rent in the North? A closer look at the work of these two writers suggests the discordant reverberations of 40 Acres and a Mule in the 1930s as a rallying cry for reparations, a cautionary tale, and a bad object that must be shed. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly go into this kind of specific case study, and then I'll be done. Okay. Reconstruction. So Reconstruction served as a powerful historical analog for Americans of all stripes during the Great Depression. As historical epochs coming after redefining moments of crisis, the Reconstruction era from 1865 to 1877 and the Great Depression spanning the 1930s both featured mass migration, an expansion of the federal government undertaking mammoth rebuilding efforts, and the normalization of extra-state racial violence. For white Southerners, the expansion of the federal government under the New Deal on the worst fears of the period as a revived Reconstruction era. The Reconstruction was also on the minds of Black Americans in the 1930s, many of whom felt hopeful for better legislative and social opportunities in FDR's America, even as the Black intelligentsia remained bitterly divided about the decade's reconstructive possibilities. I'm not going to talk too much about these images, though there's like some world in which I'm also writing about these images. It's not this one right now, but I'm interested in the ways that the kind of visual legacy of Reconstruction from the period, ones that are kind of pro a hearty Reconstruction and even propaganda against Reconstruction, are both interested in domestic space and residential space and architecture as kind of telegraphing both the dream and the nightmare of Reconstruction, right? This idea of a domestic space occupied by a kind of expanded Black family as being key to this Harper's Weekly image of Reconstruction that was published even before the war is over. And then this propaganda sheet from Pennsylvania in 1866 that is the kind of threat of the oversized Black on this farmland, and this visualization of the Freedmen's Bureau as a Capitol building, that the Freedmen's Bureau is an actual architectural structure, is super interesting to me. So I think there's a lot one could say about the kind of architectural imagination of Reconstruction in the actual historical period of Reconstruction, but that's not what I'm doing at this moment, but I am intrigued by the possibility. Okay, so let me go back to the 30s and set the scene for what's going on in the Black public sphere around politics and civil rights in this period. So the 30s is a moment of generational fissure between in the Black public sphere, featuring battles between kind of young upstart Black thinkers like E. Franklin Frazier, Ralph Bunche, Charles Johnson, and Richard Wright on the one hand, and kind of the old guard of the Black intelligentsia like W.B. Du Bois, Kelly Miller, and Carter G. Woodson. And their fight really coalesced around how to prioritize the relationship between race and class. So while the younger generation committed to the belief that, quote, class solidarity of laborers in the United States will hold across the color line, as Du Bois summarized their position, he found their faith in class solidarity trumping racial affiliation to be naive. Du Bois himself abruptly came to support a strategic economic Black separatism in the early 1930s, a sharp break with his militant insistence on anti-segregation for decades prior. The Great Depression hastened his disillusionment with, as James O. Young puts it, quote, interracial unity, either with the working class, New Deal liberals, or with Communist Party radicals, end quote. As the economic downturn disproportionately left Black Americans dispossessed, out of work, and excluded from the New Deal's benefits. Du Bois came to believe in the 30s that concentrated Black economic power was the only practical solution to an evergreen system of American apartheid. So this is the context in which Du Bois wrote his very mammoth 1935 chronicle, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880. Over 100 pages, Du Bois painstakingly debunks the myths that white historians had previously spun about Reconstruction in order to reclaim the value of its nascent experiments in democracy and equity. While Du Bois pragmatically rejected investing any more time in fostering interracial solidarity in the 30s, he simultaneously immersed himself in what he called Reconstruction's splendid failure to realize an interracial working class coalition. This potential fizzled, Du Bois argues, because the financial incentives for maintaining Black oppression for both Northern and Southern white elites proved just too lucrative. He remorsefully charts how the ruling classes prevented a laboring alliance between poor whites and freed persons and effectively limited Black land ownership in order to profit from ongoing Black servitude through peonage. Across Black Reconstruction, Du Bois mourns the lost opportunity to massively redistribute Southern land to the freed persons who had worked it. I mean, he basically sees Reconstruction as this missed opportunity, this radical opportunity where land was going to be redistributed to the previously enslaved, where you could have had this kind of real revolution between the Black and white working classes in the South that was basically scuttled by the pressures of capitalism. But these are the moments where he's really kind of trying to describe how much the question or the problem of land was so central to the imaginary of Reconstruction. He says, quote, "If the basic problem of Reconstruction in the South was economic, the kernel of the economic situation was the land. Du Bois asserts that while those in the industrial North were slow to realize the importance of land to the South's economic, civic, and social development, quote, the Negro unerringly and insistently led the way in insisting on the centrality of land to their sovereignty. Quote, the main question to which the Negroes returned again and again was the problem of owning land, as, quote, Negroes expressed their right to the land and the deep importance of this right." And this was such a revolutionary claim because the kind of overarching myth, historical truth about Reconstruction in this period is that Blacks were passive, they didn't want anything, they were lazy, and Reconstruction failed because they were lazy and didn't have the capacity to own and to be stewards of their own sovereignty. And Du Bois insisting, actually, no, land is what drove the Black drive to sovereignty is a revolutionary claim in this period. Du Bois's argument about the land's importance to freed persons during Reconstruction largely rests on his naturalization of Black yearning for possession. Such an approach not only spoke back to Reconstruction's historiography, but also rebutted more contemporary claims forwarded by realtors and land economists that Blacks, and specifically Black migrants from the South, were hard on property due to a mixture of apathy, inexperience, and a predisposition for degeneration that spread to all they touch. So what I'm trying to work through here is the way that these claims are not only about Reconstruction, right, but he's also speaking to the contemporary situation of mass housing, right, where this idea that Blacks were incapable of actually being good tenders of the land because they had less experience with ownership, because they were once owned, is an active circulation in the 10s, 20s, and 30s in the US. So both of these contexts are shaping Du Bois's underscoring a freed person's hunger for land, which they could both own and work, which he emphasizes, as the natural outcome of slavery. He says here, this last quote, the Negroes were willing to work and did work, but they wanted land to work and they wanted to see and own the results of their toil. And I'm really interested in that. They don't just want to own, they want to see it. They want to see that they own, right? This way, this kind of perceptual system of seeing ownership becomes integral to his claim. Foregrounding the freedman's hunger for land allows Du Bois to valorize ownership as the most effective strategy for folding the newly freed into capitalist systems of production both then and now. Okay, we're getting close to the close. But Du Bois is not the only Black thinker in this period to reevaluate Reconstruction. 6 years after Black Reconstruction, novelist Richard Wright made a very different case for its legacy. Wright's 1941 photo text, 12 Million Black Voices, offers a poetic counterpoint to Du Bois's chronicle. Unlike Du Bois's vision of Reconstruction, featuring freed persons working to remake themselves through the land, Wright focuses on Blacks after emancipation who strategically rejected the land that had incentivized their theft and enslavement for so long. He depicts Reconstruction as a time when Blacks could finally be free from the land rather than more deeply tethered to it. Wright paired images he selected from the Farm Security Administration's photographic archive, and a few that he took himself, with a lyrical narrative of Black life from colonial encounter in Africa to the present. Using a univocal we to speak for the 12 million Africans shipped to the New World and their descendants, Wright set out to demonstrate on behalf of the working class, Black folk, that, quote, our history is far stranger than you suspect, and we are not what we seem. So where Du Bois is out here claiming that all Blacks wanted was to own and see their land, right? To have this kind of transparent empirical relationship to ownership. Wright is claiming that things are not as you think that they appear, even as he's using a photographic archive to make this claim. So while Du Bois understood Reconstruction as history's tragic debut, treats this era as a slight picaresque, according it only a few paragraphs of description. So it's really striking. He's telling this like hundreds of years story of Black life in the Western Hemisphere, basically. And Reconstruction gets just a few sentences of attention. It's not that interesting to Wright. He says, quote, 4 million of us Black folks stranded and bewildered upon the land after emancipation. After he notes that, he just gives a few of the limited options available to the newly freed. Quote, some of us turned back to the same lords of the land who had helped us as slaves and begged for work, while others, quote, entered a new kind of bondage, sharecropping. But Wright devotes most of his attention to those who charted a third path. Glad to be free, he writes, some of us drifted and gave way to every vagary of impulse that swept through us. Confined for centuries to the life of the cotton field, many of us possessed no feelings of family, home, community, race, church, or progress. We could scarcely believe that we were free, and our restlessness and incessant mobility were our naive way of testing that freedom. Just as a kitten stretches and yawns after a long sleep, so thousands of us tramped from place to place for the sheer sake of moving, looking, wandering, landless upon the land. So whereas Du Bois detailed a Reconstruction ethos organized around Black hunger for the land and to be in one place, Wright represents this period as one where Blacks tested out what it might look like to be free of it. For Wright, the most meaningful way to reconstruct was to turn one's back on the land for good. Wright never uses the term Reconstruction to describe this historical moment after emancipation. His refusal of this proper periodizing name is in keeping with his broader investment in capturing folk experience often left out of formal histories. But Wright's avoidance of the term Reconstruction also reflects his unwillingness to render this period as one concerned with rebuilding, hopeful or otherwise. Wright instead renders the newly emancipated as seeking to lose attachments, including to property, after the shackles of slavery. If the sovereign possession of property is not the end game for Black liberation, Wright suggests, a vision of Reconstruction organized around the broken promise of 40 acres and a mule becomes less pivotal, just one more iteration of Black injury during the long regime of racial capitalism, rather than an event of any particular or useful value, as Du Bois frames it. Wright ultimately posits a positive vision for Reconstruction in 12 Million Black Voices, rooted not in ownership or the family unit, but in collectivization. He says, after being pulverized by slavery and purged of our cultural heritage, we are unable to establish our family groups upon a basis of property ownership. For the most part, our delicate families are held together by love, sympathy, pity, and the goading knowledge that we must work together to make a crop, unquote. The Moynihan Report of 1965 would later declare the divergence of some Black family structures from traditional bourgeois norms to be a handicap to be overcome. But Wright claims divergent Black family organizations purposefully unoptimized for capitalist reproduction as a strength. In the wake of slavery's alleged pulverizations of Black culture, as well as ongoing Black exclusion from avenues of advancement, Wright cast the Black folk as revolutionaries, already decentering private property in both their residential and working lives. This is my last paragraph. As many Blacks in the early 20th century continued to give up on Southern land ownership to move into redline Northern cities with few avenues for ownership, and as the Great Depression's long shadow continued to further lay bare ownership's pitfalls, the utility of Reconstruction's broken property promises remained an open question. Du Bois's emphasis on Black desire for land possession during the post-emancipation era stages ownership as the ongoing fertile terrain for Black enfranchisement. Wright, on the other hand, mines the same period for his latent revolutionary animus, rooted in Black rejection of owned land, begetting new social collectives. For both of these thinkers, the historical question of Black orientation to ownership had direct consequences for defining its meaningfulness within the property regimes and real estate imaginaries of their immediate present. 40 acres and a mule emerges for them not so much as the given terrain for reparations, but as a cipher for valuing mass ownership itself as the social, economic, affective, and political animus for Black life, past and present.